Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Hydrogen Rising. I'm Sandi Safro, and if my voice sounds clearer today, it's because I finally got myself a brand new microphone. We saw in the comments that one of our listeners noted that it sounded like we were talking to you from Mars on an AM radio frequency, so hopefully this is a bit better, but please let us know. I have the pleasure today of co-hosting this episode with a guest co-host, Buck Endemann. Buck is a partner in K&L Gates' San Francisco office, where he co-leads the firm's global power practice, focusing significantly on renewable energy projects, and he also co-leads the firm's biogas practice. Buck's name will be familiar to our listeners from our episode in March on California's role in the hydrogen economy and the state's LCFS program. Our episode today is going to focus on a bit of an amalgamation of those issues. We'll be talking about credits and certificates tied to carbon emissions reductions, a bit about renewable natural gas, and of course, we'll be talking about hydrogen. We'll get into this more later with our guest, but the issuance of credits is really a key issue for a number of commercial and policy goals that countries around the world and a number of states in the US are pursuing with respect to hydrogen. We've talked in past episodes about certificates of origin and traceability. And as we'll talk about today, the certificates related to greenhouse gas emissions or emissions reductions can help create clarity and transparency for market participants and governments when it comes to these issues, particularly as the hydrogen economies grow and we have a greater potential for commingling of this fungible commodity in transportation or storage. Certificates also, of course, play a significant role for market participants in securing government funding. And Buck, with that, I will turn it over to you to introduce our guest and to give a bit more background. And thank you, Buck, for joining us today.
Absolutely, Sandy. It's wonderful to be back on the Hydrogen Rising podcast. And today, I'm really excited to welcome our guest, Ben Gerber, who's the president and CEO of the Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking System, or M-RETS. Now, our listeners might have seen M-RETS in the news, partnering with Google earlier in the spring to prove out and track Google's 24/7 renewable electricity claims. But really just as exciting and probably more relevant to this podcast is M-RETS' work on the thermal or the molecule side of the energy transition. M-RETS has pioneered a new type of environmental credit, the Renewable Thermal Certificate, or RTC, that can be thought of like a REC for renewable natural gas or hydrogen. And we've already seen states like Oregon adopt RTCs into their state compliance processes, so starting to get some significant traction out there. As stakeholders and shareholders are taking a closer, data-driven look into utility and corporate announcements on renewable energy, M-RETS is really taking the lead here on building data infrastructure to back up those claims. So with that, I'm really privileged to welcome Ben to the Hydrogen Rising podcast. And Ben, it's great to see you again.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk about this important issue. And as we're seeing the importance of data and tracking to achieve goals, whether it's the announcement on Friday at the end of Climate Week that Google, along with M-RETS and a bunch of other partners, are launching a 24/7 kind of carbon-free energy platform to help that, we see that thermal emissions are actually just as important and unfortunately, to a large extent, ignored by people across the spectrum, whether it's environmentalists to people looking to create business opportunities. So the more that we can get the word out there, the better. And what we looked at is one of the big impediments to the development of a renewable thermal market was what we saw in the early 2000s with renewable electricity. Both have the same issue when you put them into a common carrier, or so you put them on a transmission, put renewable electrons on a transmission line, or you put gas into a pipeline system, you have the same issue. You have to decouple the environmental commodity, or the REC, or the Renewable Thermal Certificate, as we're calling them, from the physical commodity. And we saw this very need arise, again, just like it was in the early days of renewable electricity, so that you could utilize those transportation networks and still create a valuable claim to the end user. And so while you might not be getting those electrons or those molecules, and most likely you're not because it flows under the laws of physics, we can still create a separate tracking mechanism to show through the chain of custody how the production to end use of the commodity.
That's great, Ben. And that actually ties, I think, a little bit into the first question that we have for you, which is, I think a number of our listeners are probably familiar with the renewable energy credits or the RECs, but may not have heard of the Renewable Thermal Certificate or the RTC. And I know you talked a little bit about this already, but can you talk about how the RTCs compare with RECs, what the difference is between them, why we need them, and then also be really interested, although I realize I'm asking you an incredibly complex question at this point, but I'd be really interested in if you could talk a little bit about how much of the value or supply chain RTCs evaluate.
Yeah, to give you an idea of how this came to be, I think I'm going to give you a quick origin story of M-RETS, but I promise it's an important piece of that, which is we're a small nonprofit, and I say that we're $2 million a year in revenue. And I think that's important. One, not just because we're transparent, we talk about that, but two, to understand that this is not overly complex. It just people needed to step up and take leadership, and we saw the opportunity. So we built our own software platform for RECs, launched in 2018, and we realized software is really expensive. Even if tell you, oh, you can run it for this much, you got to double that. And so we looked at, well, how could we leverage this investment that we made? And renewable thermal actually fit really well in. And not just because it was tracking a commodity of a single measurement. That is nice when you're looking at software. But what we saw happening in renewable electricity markets was this move away from volumetric claims. So to say you're 100% renewable, to the idea of I want to know what my impact on carbon is in the electricity grid, which matches very well with thermal, because the difference between decatherms produced by different procedures, whether it's blue hydrogen using natural gas or green hydrogen using renewable electrons, or biogas or renewable natural gas where the impurities have been removed, whether you're allowed to claim the upstream avoided methane, all of those are really important. And so carbon becomes really just as important as the volumes. And we see the renewable energy markets moving that way, not just in electricity, but it sets everything up really well for thermal. And I think that's really important. And so what we looked at is talk to some of the other registry providers that existed. I think a great thing about the energy world is Europe tends to lead on things, but then we're a lot less restricted based on policies and laws in the United States. So we can learn from their failures and then build things a little bit differently. So I like to give some of my European colleagues a lot of ribbings there, but I do think we're seeing this on electricity, that they are much more restricted, and how a geo is defined in EU directive as 1 megawatt hour, where we didn't have that. Just like that, we can start attributing carbon right off the bat, where now you're starting to see the European biogas registries do that. We started out with that. Not saying that we did it first or we had the first idea. It just shows that because of the lack of regulation, it sometimes means we're slower to uptake markets, but we can be a little more innovative. And so we built this around that not every decatherm is equal. And that isn't a requirement. So we don't require carbon intensities, but we do believe, and I personally believe, that that's the way to scale this market. Because if you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint by switching out your natural gas for renewable natural gas or something else, then it's really critical to understand what that carbon footprint is, and from a life cycle standpoint. So really, where's the value? You kind of ask, well, where's the value? So it's really important to have a tracking system. And I know, and sometimes we're considered an annoyance. Until recently, we were like the least important part of any conference. We were always the last to go, and everyone was already leaving and packing their bags. Oh, let's hear what's happening in registries. I think there's a little bit of a frustration. Maybe I have a chip on my shoulder for two reasons, and I'll explain those. One is that we do create a really important foundation for the market. But because they were neglected for so long, and you see this in electricity and gas around the world, the technology was really bad. And there's this idea that, oh, that's just what they do. And so we thought we need to take a technology first approach, but also the registries are really critical in building value in the chain. And so I think what we sought to do is build a tracking system that would not just generate certificates and not just help with compliance, but provide a mechanism for liquidity. Because right now, until there was a registry, everything was paper attestations, which a lot of people don't trust. Try going into a corporate boardroom and explaining scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions and how this is going to help us reduce things. And then say, oh, by the way, we're just buying these paper contracts that this person is saying they never sold anything else to anyone else, but there's no centralized repository where I can validate that. Those markets can still exist, and they will, just like they do on rec side, but we think it's really important to have that centralized authority that can act as an issuer and to validate claims both. And the compliance side, whether it's the SB 98 implementation in Oregon, which we are been appointed by their system as right now the only certified tracking system, but then also what we're seeing happen around the country with California, Minnesota just established, finally passed a policy, and we're continuing to see more and more structured renewable gas pieces, which importantly will lead into, I know what the real piece is hydrogen. I know it's easy to just skip over those markets, and people want to, because hydrogen right now can kind of suck the air out of the room when you're at a conference or in a discussion, but these markets are going to be the platform for hydrogen to really take it to the next level. I believe. I strongly believe that, and I think we're starting to see that.
That's great to hear. I think especially as we start to think about some of the commercial issues that market participants are currently facing and are going to continue to face as we look to build out this hydrogen economy. I guess one question that I wanted to make sure to ask you was, in terms of the value chain or the supply chain, how far up or down the supply chain do RTCs evaluate? So for example, I think, one of the questions that commercial parties are looking at in the hydrogen space is, what do you do in the event that you need cover? If you are a supplier and you're supposed to be supplying electrolytic hydrogen from some renewable power source, and you're, can't deliver that day or can't deliver for the period, and you go to source from a third party, is that, something that impacts the analysis of the RTC on the back end?
I think it's important actually to break up the discussion in a way that kind of shows the important future that hydrogen has. And I hope you'll indulge me there. You can say no if you want.
No, please go ahead.
I'm just kidding. Buck wouldn't have invited me if he knew I was going to do that. But I think what makes hydrogen really interesting is the fact that it can play in both electricity markets as well as thermal markets. So it's one of the few fuel sources that will actually be able to do that in a more direct way. Obviously, you can say, well, if you electrify your heating and things like that. But what's interesting about hydrogen is we see a market where people will be able to pick based on where the value is, because it could act as a firm load in a CT turbine. You may use renewable hydrogen to create RECs. And if there is a market based on time, which we're looking at building the whole idea of the 24/7, then you can do that. You can essentially use hydrogen as a storage medium, and may, based on how we see hydrogen play out, get a lot more benefit. So using curtailed renewables to create hydrogen, to then use it for times when there's a need for more renewable energy. There's that. But you just as importantly, you can switch to the thermal market based on where prices are going there. So we just saw what happened with the spike in gas prices with what happened in Texas. I mean, we felt it all the way up into Minnesota, and they're investigating the utilities for whether they were prudent in their actions all the way up to the northern part of the country. And so it just as much as you could sell that into electricity, you could sell that into gas markets to provide not just a renewable source, but also financial opportunity. I mean, you have to have that. If we just always solely rely on compliance requirements, you're probably not going to get anywhere. Just like we've seen renewables they got their footing, and now they're the cheapest source of electricity. So then you'd be able to sell that into that hydrogen into the thermal markets. And I think what is important to also realize is that all of this data that we're talking about, whether it's grid carbon intensity, the curtail data, is an important piece to getting the legitimacy from some of these groups, both on the left and the right, that oppose hydrogen. So you have a group of people that want zero combustion and that any combustion of hydrogen is a bad thing. Well, if you can show through data that that we were using renewables at times where they weren't required, or that we weren't taking zero carbon electricity from the grid and using it to produce something else, so that you're increasing coal or natural gas or whatever. If we can show through the data, we can actually build a case to provide, to help bring down some of that opposition. You're never going to get rid of it, but I think we're starting to see, it's interesting, just like people focused on, okay, we need gas to replace coal. Well, now gas is the enemy. And so we're looking at, all right, well, how are people opposing that? I think we're starting to see people gravitate towards this argument that renewable hydrogen in the gas pipelines is just a way to increase fossil fuel investment, and we should oppose it at all costs. I vehemently disagree with that. I think it's a short-sighted argument, but it's winning, and there are groups pushing it. So again, bringing that data into this discussion, I think, will be really important to the growth. We can say we're just going to slam through all of these things. I come from a policy background as well, but that doesn't always work well. And so I think building this case as a business community, or as both a pro environment movement and a pro markets movement, I think will be really critical.
So Ben, you had a really good point there, and that is that hydrogen is the type of fuel that can both play in the power demand side as well as the transportation, or say the fuel side. So how will, let's just call them RECs on one hand to track renewable electricity, and RTCs or some other instrument on the other hand that track renewable thermal claims, what sorts of attributes will both of those certificates have to share? So if you're a company that is deciding on using hydrogen for a particular application, you can look at really the fundamental question of mitigating the carbon impact and make a smart decision on how you direct your hydrogen, whether to use it for power, whether to use it for fuel. Maybe it's not a company, maybe if you're a policymaker or something like that. What attributes will those renewable energy credits have to share?
Yeah, and I think that's very similar to how we were looking at scaling this thermal market, is, as I like to refer to as an open disclosure, where the more data you disclose to the market, hopefully the more compensation you will get when you go to sell the attributes. So if you have a carbon intensity, which can be very expensive to have someone audit and provide the documentation that we required. I've heard it can be as cheap as $5,000 to $10,000, as much as $30,000 to $40,000, depending on how complex your systems are, where you're getting your inputs, things like that. And there's a whole market around that. That you don't have to do that. And so there's an idea that just like on RECs, RTCs may exist as some zero scope to emissions accounting scheme. I don't personally I think that's a great step. I don't want to say no. We probably are going to have to stop there for a little bit. And unfortunately, WRI has removed their scope 1 emissions reductions guidance on the use of renewable natural gas schemes for scope 1 emissions reductions, which really put a halt on the market globally. And I think actually substantially hurt the market, where we were seeing deals about to happen. And because of the inability of clear guidance, really stop some of these deals. As I mentioned before, trying to explain that in a boardroom and then saying, well, it's not clear because this environmental group removed their guidance. It's a problem. But I think to kind of go back to, I got lost for a second, but I think it was important detail, which is how this instrument will work. And so I think there is obviously the ability to have it a zero scope instrument, but I think more importantly, it's looking at, well, where is your best carbon use for this hydrogen? And so you could look at what is happening in gas markets, what is happening in the electricity markets, and then be able to provide some sort of value there. And so it's hard to say because it's going to get into all of this data, but I think that if RECs move more to a scope 1 instrument with the right data, where you can say, here's what I helped avoid by investing in this project or buying this electron, you may be able to take that same data and say, well, what is better, buying, this hydro or this wind or nuclear or solar or carbon-free energy, or using hydrogen here as a combustion mechanism, and having some sort of, the nice thing about our system is it's built on one platform. So we should be able to efficiently take the data from the RTC system and move it into the REC system or vice versa. And then it really gets into the accounting, how if you have a negative CI in a thermal market, because you can do that, but that's not available or accepted in REC markets, you may want to get a better value because of the decarbonization impact always in thermal. But if they both have that, then I think it will be interesting to see. This is where automation will come in, is I think we're talking about a level of sophistication that humans could do, but and I don't want you to think it needs to be AI or blockchain or you can throw a lot of buzzwords out there. You can write software code to automate this and look at different markets and decide which is the best use of your attribute. And because all of these markets are backward looking, this is not really real time. You can look at it and be able to see. And I think you'll see specialists evolve to help provide you that guidance on where you should sell your attributes.
Now, Ben, you have a policy background and you know a lot, obviously, about the electricity markets, the thermal markets, and now you're evaluating the system for hydrogen. But beyond sort of RTCs, tracking registries and such, back to your policy roots, are there regulatory or policy reforms that you see right now that could be removed or implemented to help accelerate the development of a hydrogen economy?
Yeah, so I think, considering myself more on the conservative environmentalist, I saw a lot of these arguments happen with RPS policies, and I worked at the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce for a while, so I saw people saying these are too expensive. But it was the same arguments you're actually hearing against for opponents of RNG. Although what's nice is the opposite is in one area is happening, which is that gas utilities want this. Gas utilities are actually seeing that it's an existential threat. If they don't find a way to decarbonize their systems, they will be shut out of any revenue growth opportunities and eventually become too small to operate. And so they are jumping in to say, look, we can provide a pathway to decarbonization. It doesn't always make sense to electrify. So I use this example that, and it's real data that I've verified. But in Minnesota, for example, during the polar vortex, when the high was -30, the demand for gas for CenterPoint Energy, which is this one utility of 1 million customers, it doesn't even cover the St. Paul area, just Minneapolis, had a peak gas demand of 20 gigawatts. Well, Minnesota's installed renewable capacity is like 5 gigawatts of renewable, and we're in a top 10 state. So you look at that, like maybe firm demand is like 2.5. So we'd have to build out 10 times the amount of renewables just to meet that demand. When it's -30, it's kind of like when it's 120 in Arizona, you have to have your AC working. And so, to build that's a lot of infrastructure to build. And so it's not possible to electrify everything in every place, realistically. I mean, in theory you could, but in reality, to build all that infrastructure. And so we need to figure out a way to deal with this. And so I think states need to understand that and helping to facilitate it. So going back to that, you hear, oh, we don't like that gas on our system. It's just like what people said about distributed energy. Oh, it's bad electrons. We can't control it. Well, to get into the distribution and transportation system, you have to meet quality guidelines, just like fossil gas. I mean, if you pull fossil gas out of the ground, most of it needs to be processed somewhere. It's not just taken right out of the ground. There's multiple, chemicals or not polluted, but there's hydrogen sulfide, other things in there. And so you do have to refine it, just like you would renewable natural gas or hydrogen. Although if you're doing electrolysis, you probably don't have to do that. But these processes are important. So where we could get some help is in states creating interconnection guidelines if they don't have them, because we've heard, well, we don't have an interconnection guideline in this area, so we can't really accept your gas. So things like that. And it also just education. I mean, I've heard some folks at a commission once say, we don't really understand what to do here. They're using PVC pipes to connect into this interstate pipeline, and that worries us. Well, it's like, well, that's actually pretty common, and it's actually PVC pipes are better than steel, especially you're moving hydrogen or renewable natural gas. So just those like simple education things can help give people a better understanding. And then you get to, should there be mandates? I think at M-RETS as an organization, we are policy neutral on those kind of things, and we would say if you want to have a mandate or requirement, we can help you track it. But whatever you do, make sure that you have goals. And I think that's one thing you don't hear enough of in policy, though, is like, what is your goal? Because we've seen that in through working through some of the processes, which is like, we want renewable natural gas. Well, do you want to have it be, is this a carbon decarbonization strategy? Then have a carbon-based target to reduce your carbon intensity by X, and we can measure that. If it's just volumes and you want to incentivize production in your state or in your surrounding states, then create a policy around that.
Well, thank you, Ben. And thank you, Buck, for joining me today. This has been a really great conversation. And I think we're probably going to need to do a part 2 on this topic. And hopefully we can have you back, Ben, and you as well, Buck, to co-host. Thank you, as always, to our listeners. If you have topics that you'd like us to discuss, please send either me or David Wachner an email or leave us a comment on one of the apps. And if you like what you heard today, go ahead and hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app so that you won't miss an episode. Folks also often ask about resources on hydrogen, and I would definitely continue to recommend checking out K&L Gates Hydrogen Handbook. It's a free resource available at klgates.com/hydrogen. If you have questions about anything that we discussed on today's episode, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Buck, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes, and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.